Well, this development then coming out this week is the European Union funding for health and electoral processes in Zimbabwe a sign of slow lifting of sanctions on the country. This week, the EU announced that it has allocated 1.5 million euros for the Zimbabwean government. But what does this mean then for the economic future of Zimbabwe? For more on this discussion, I'm joined in studio by Mr. Rutendo Matinyarare of the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement. Mr. Matinyarare, a good morning to you. Welcome to the agenda, and thank you so much for speaking to us. The organization ZASIM that you chair has for years been calling for the lift of sanctions, for the lifting of sanctions. I mean, your initial reaction when you heard of this money coming in from the EU towards the Zim government?
Well, first of all, I've got two emotions to this issue. First of all, we're happy to see a de-escalation of sanctions. It started in February, where the Europeans removed 4 of their 5 sanctions to only leave sanctions on the Zimbabwe defense industries. We still feel that leaving sanctions on the Zimbabwe defense industries is a persecution of Zimbabwe because of the role that the Zimbabwe defense industries and Zimbabwe defense forces were playing, particularly in countries like Congo, where the Europeans have got interests, and the Zimbabwe defense forces going to Congo and disturbing the destabilization of Congo, which is beginning to happen now, was part of the reasons why they put those sanctions on Zimbabwe, and they're maintaining them because they don't want Zimbabwe's military to play the role that it played in fighting apartheid and fighting this imperialism that is still happening in Congo today. But we're happy that the Europeans have de-escalated. They have begun to build relationships again with Zimbabwe, because part and parcel of why we used to say that sanctions are not targeted is that when the Europeans imposed their sanctions in 2002, they actually stopped the aid that they had promised at the Lancaster House Conference in 1980 when we negotiated for our independence. They had blocked $132 million that was supposed to be for aid and the improvement of Zimbabwe as part and parcel of reparations for colonialism.
You've talked over the past few days about the role that ZASIM has played, your organization, in writing up legislation with the Zimbabwean government that essentially led to what you say is essentially leading up towards what we're starting to see, the softening of sanctions. The Patriotic Act. What was that, and why was it important that you lobbied for that act to be written into law by the Zimbabwean government? See,
the very first thing that was a problem with Zimbabwe is issue of optics. This perception that Zimbabwe is a violent country with a violent government was something that we had to fight. But we had to fight that by challenging the sanctions that were put on Zimbabwe, supposedly for human rights violations. And the very first thing we had to challenge is to say, if Zimbabwe has violated human rights, then in which court with jurisdiction in Zimbabwe have these violations of human rights been tested? Where have they been proved? Who has been found guilty? And now that there is punishment on people, including all Zimbabweans, how is it that these sanctions are punishment for human rights violations that have not been tried? So that was the very first thing. The next thing was to take this fight into the multilateral space. So we said to the government of Zimbabwe, go to the United Nations, go to the Human Rights Council, because that is the only body internationally that has the authority to try these things.
I'm going to step in here because I think you're moving forward into where you took the act globally. I'm saying to you, what was the Patriotic Act? Let's start there.
So the Patriotic Act was part and parcel fulfilling these things that I'm talking about, punishing those that have called for sanctions on Zimbabweans so that Zimbabweans can be persecuted by being deprived water, healthcare, the right to life, right to education, and the right for their government to deliver services to them, because sanctions have been levied upon that government illegitimately and illegally by the Western nations outside the United Nations. And we have to remember that the West went to the United Nations in 2008, asked for the United Nations to put sanctions on Zimbabwe, and the Security Council did not agree to that. So these sanctions are illegal. And so for that reason, anybody who calls for sanctions, for Zimbabweans to be collectively punished, to force those people to vote for anyone else other than the government, is actually creating an environment of persecution, which is a crime against humanity, for political reasons.
That's an interesting one, because Zimbabwe is, getting closer and closer to very important elections for the country, where you see the EU then stepping forward and saying, we're going to help you fund health systems that have been heavily strained in the country, but also assist with electoral process. What do you think the trickle-down effect of that is going to be for the election of Zimbabwe that's coming up? Or what does it say about Zimbabweans across the globe, really, about how government is faring?
We actually believe that there shouldn't be any sanctions in Zimbabwe as long as there is a use of sanctions to persecute the publics of Zimbabwe, to force them to vote for anything other than the local government. We are saying that as long as there's sanctions that deprive the government of delivering services, and sanctions have been put deliberately for that, which is what the Zimbabwe Zimbabwean Act, which is the United States law, says. It wants to help Zimbabweans get democratic change. They're not asking Zimbabweans if they want to maintain their government. They only want to help Zimbabwe to achieve democratic change. And so when you look at the sanctions, when you look at the restrictions, you realize that it's collective punishment of Zimbabweans to bring change.
Right.
And we're saying that can't create an environment for free and fair elections.
What about the economic future of Zimbabweans, where you're starting to see this, let's call it an easing of sanctions, because we haven't had that conversation yet? You've got the calls that are being made even by the South African president for sanctions to be lifted. What do these changes mean for the many Zimbabweans who are living in South Africa that have left because of the tough economic position that their country is in? What do they then internalize from the discussion that we're having right now?
And there's a good question that you ask, Zimbabweans in South Africa versus Zimbabweans at home. The Zimbabweans at home have begun to get used to these sanctions, and they've begun to understand how to bust these sanctions. And one of the biggest sanction busters for Zimbabwe right now has been its diaspora. So the millions of Zimbabweans that are outside the country earning foreign currency that comes home, and that is not restricted by the restrictions that our exports have been able to keep that country afloat. But that is beginning to have benefits. It's having benefits in mining, agriculture, construction, and there's a boom happening in the economy. Hence it grew by 6% last year. And the business people in Zimbabwe are now indigenous Zimbabweans, because the interregnum or the vacuum left by the Western countries has allowed them to fill that gap. They don't want the sanctions to go, because they're saying that we have become monopolies, we have grown, we have built local businesses, and we've only been able to do that because of sanctions. However, if the sanctions go, competition comes in, and that competition erodes the amount of the economy that we currently control. However, we keep saying to them that the good, be it as may, that you're controlling an economy, it could be a bigger cake if investment can come in, if we can have free trade, and that bigger cake then helps these people that get displaced as refugees to get jobs in the economy and to start their own businesses. I myself, marketing consultant, for me to have a marketing consultancy, I need a functional economy that actually has a predominantly formal economy and not a non-formal economy.
Out there, Mr. Rutendo Matinyarare, who is chairman of the organization Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement.